Welcome to Oxford University Museum of Natural History. My name is Paul Smith, I'm the director. And we're delighted to be collaborating this year with the Oxford Leader Festival. This is the place that, as part of its opening ceremony, staged the great debate between the Bishop of Oxford and Thomas Henry Huxley, and the first place where evolution was publicly debated. But if we cast our minds back to the early 19th century, Oxford as an institution was beginning to fall behind in terms of science. Other Enlightenment universities in Edinburgh, London, Manchester, even Birmingham were beginning to surge ahead, particularly in medical science. And a group of scientists in Oxford began to think that what was needed was less isolated working and the creation of a science faculty. And that's how this building came about. It was designed as the entire science faculty of the University of Oxford, with the different academic departments ranged around the cloisters, but then with a museum tucked away in its centre. And in a way, that was the networking space that was provided by the museum area. The project itself was the result of many decades of frustrating dialogue, trying to get momentum behind the project, sometimes getting a little bit of momentum, other times failing. But it was when Henry Ackland, a young academic when he started, who later became the Regius Professor of Medicine, got involved, that things really began to surge along. And despite the fact that they started in the 1830s, by the 1850s they still didn't have any money. But then in 1855 they got a grant of £30,000 to create the museum. That's about £3 million in today's money. It was never enough. The museum is unfinished to this day. In actual fact, just to get the museum to the state we see it in today, they had to go back to the university another 63 times in 10 years for additional funding. Ackland was a close friend of John Ruskin, the art critic and art influencer, as we would perhaps now call him. And the moment they got the go-ahead for the museum and the funding in place, he turned to Ruskin and asked for help with the design. It was at the time that Ruskin was involved with the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, so he enlisted the members of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. And not just the male members, the painters who we tend to know. We also have designs by some of the female affiliates of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, but also the lesser-known artists, the sculptors, and the decorative artists who were associated with the movement. The work was completed in 1860. Not without its travails. The roof collapsed in 1859 and had to be completely rebuilt. It was a very experimental fusion of Gothic, an art form that Ruskin felt could best represent natural history, with those railway materials, as Ruskin described them, iron and glass. And there's no building quite like it. It's an architectural dead end. It still leaks through its glass roof. And nevertheless, it's been a really significant place in the history of science.
When HMS Beagle set out from Plymouth in December 1831 with the young Charles Darwin aboard, its main purpose was not to inspire a revolution in scientific thinking, but to produce detailed maps of the coast of South America and of the Pacific. It was just one of many voyages of exploration undertaken by sailing ships in the later 18th and early 19th century, such as the voyages of James Cook, Jean-François Lapérouse, and George Vancouver. These voyages of mapping and exploration were made possible by the invention of the ship's chronometer, a clock which was so reliable, even in a rolling, tossing ship, that sailors could use it to work out how far east or west the ship was, its longitude. There was more than curiosity behind these journeys, of course. The hope was to discover new havens for ships, new opportunities for trade, and other ways for individual European countries to increase their influence and power. As the 19th century went on, and particularly with the development of the steamship, this grew into the colonial project, which drew a great deal of the world together under European flags, sadly too often to the detriment of the peoples whose homelands were colonized. But for Europeans, the way that the world opened up to them as a result of these voyages was often enormously exciting. Darwin was particularly inspired by the writings of Alexander von Humboldt, who had travelled to South America 30 years before, and when the Beagle made its first landfall in the tropics, on the Cape Verde Islands, he found that the reality was even better. "Never in my wildest castles of the air did I imagine this," he wrote. "New insects fluttering about still newer flowers. It has been for me a glorious day, like giving to a blind man eyes." The beauty of the natural world and its extraordinary complexity continued to inspire Darwin for the rest of his life. And this fascination with nature and the emotions it provokes is one of the aspects of the great debate that we've found reflected in song. The first two songs by Ernest Chausson are love songs, but they are also poems about nature. The first, La Dernière Feuille, which you heard earlier, describes the bleakness of a wood in winter, the almost bare trees, and a lonely bird that the poem describes are brought to mind by the rocking beat of the chordal accompaniment, mainly in crotchets, but moving into quavers in the middle section. This is very much a northern European scene, the bleakness of winter only mitigated by the hope of the returning spring. This sense that human emotion is reflected in nature, which has been important in poetry at least since the Romantics, is given a more exotic twist in the second song, which we'll hear in a minute. This song, Le Colibri, that is, the Hummingbird, relates in several ways to the voyages of exploration that I began with. There's a clue in the music to its unusual origins. The unexpected 5/4 time signature keeps the listener off balance, despite the radiance of the song's prevailing D major. Le Comte de Lille, the author of the poem Le Colibri, was born on the island of La Réunion in the Indian Ocean. His father had moved there from France, married the poet's mother, a mixed-raced woman, and started a sugar plantation. The poet spent his childhood between La Réunion and France and wrote many poems set in faraway places and describing creatures and people that were extremely exotic to his mainland French audience. The collection that includes Le Colibri, for example, also contains poems such as The Elephant, The Viper, The Jaguar's Dream, and The Advice of the Fakir. Of course, not all of them are, as it were, drawn from life. There are no hummingbirds in La Réunion, since they're native to the Americas. So although Le Comte de Lille was the product of colonialism, like Darwin, he was also inspired by the writings of those who had travelled still further afield. Nonetheless, there is some of the same delight that Darwin expresses in the richness and diversity of the tropics in the poem's opening stanzas. The green hummingbird, the king of the hills, on seeing the dew and gleaming sun shine in his nest of fine woven grass, darts into the air like a shaft of light. He hurries and flies to the nearby springs where the bamboos sound like the sea, where the red hibiscus with its heavenly scent unveils the glint of dew at its heart.
We're standing in the Huxley Room of Oxford University Museum of Natural History, the scene on June the 30th, 1860, of what became known as the Great Debate between the Bishop of Oxford, Wilberforce, and Thomas Henry Huxley, Darwin's bulldog, as he later became known. He was in his fairly early career at this time, but had already sided very much with Darwin and viewed himself as an acolyte of Darwin. We're not looking at the room in its original condition. This is a floor that was put in the 1920s. So originally we would have been looking at a gallery at this level, staring down onto the main debating area, which was the reading room floor, one level below us. Now it has a million butterflies. It's one of our principal storage rooms for the entomological collections. And it's a place of science now, as it was when the theory of evolution was first debated. it also has another place in science, in that this is where Dorothy Hodgkin, still the only British woman to have won a Nobel Prize for Science, started her scientific career with a darkroom tucked away in the corner of this space. So in addition to being the space in which the Great Debate happened and having much of that atmosphere, it also started off a Nobel Prize winning career. The museum was designed as an expression of creation, very much part of natural theology, and we see that all over in the design, celebrating the diversity of life across the planet. And that's very much the design ethos of the museum, but it was slightly undone, very much undone, in November 1859, when Darwin published On the Origin of Species. He'd already been in touch with John Phillips, the first keeper of the museum, to warn him that the book was coming out and to ask him to read a preprint, asking him to read it from cover to cover before he made his mind up finally. The museum was due to open as part of the visit of the British Association for the Advancement of Science to Oxford in June of 1860. And the university, not always quick to react and act on its feet, changed the programme so that there was a debate between the Bishop of Oxford, who, of course, was a theologian, but was a man who also had a profound interest in science, and with Darwin. Darwin was too ill to attend on the day. He was having one of his periodic, perhaps parasitic illnesses, so nominated Huxley to come in his stead. And we have to imagine a rather hot, steamy June day. Numbers vary. Some people have said 1,000 packed into this room. Perhaps 600 would be a better estimate. And it's not now as it was in those days. This is a floor that was added in the 1920s. We would have been standing looking down onto the main debating floor. So it's a famous debate that has really positioned evolution as one of the fundamental theories of science. And in that way, it perhaps has a real place in the canon of Western science, actually. And the debate followed a very set-piece routine, but it's perhaps most famous for the line that Wilberforce is alleged to have delivered, asking Huxley whether he was descended from an ape on his grandmother's or his grandfather's side. Huxley apparently whispered to Hooker, who was sitting next to him, that the Lord hath delivered him into mine hands. And then proceeded to say that, well, actually, he was quite happy, to paraphrase, being descended from an ape on his grandfather's side. But if he really did have an objection, it would be to being related to a man who, again, to paraphrase, operated outside his sphere of knowledge to try and influence the debate. There were gasps. Eyewitnesses said that people fainted. That's probably more to do with the heat than the quality of the debate. But it's gone down in history as being a really seminal moment in the public debate. It was the first place that evolution had been publicly debated. And it's gone down as that really classic moment.
In Sabbath Morning at Sea, the first of our next two songs, the poet Elizabeth Barrett Browning describes seeing the dawn from the deck of a ship one Sunday morning and thinking of the friends she had left behind in England, going to church without her. The poet, though regretting that she can't be at church, feels sure that God can still speak to her and raise her spirit to heaven. The issue of how, when, and whether to worship God brings us to the other side of the great debate, the role played by Samuel Wilberforce, Bishop of Oxford. It's easy to see the Church of England in Victorian times as rather smug and self-satisfied. Certainly this is a view of the Church that Darwin was pointing to when, writing to Huxley after the great debate, he teased him, "How durst you attack a live bishop in that fashion? I'm quite ashamed of you. Have you no reverence for the fine lawn sleeves?" But to many in the Church at this time, this was not at all how it seemed. Rather, the mid-19th century Church of England seemed by many to be facing a series of threats that required constant vigilance. Samuel Wilberforce, son of the MP and anti-slavery campaigner William Wilberforce, in fact embodied several of the challenges and contradictions that were facing the Church of England as he stood up to speak at the British Association meeting in this room in Oxford in 1860. The technological developments of the Industrial Revolution didn't just make navigating ships more reliable, they also caused a huge movement of people in Britain away from the countryside and into the towns in search of work. The parish system, which divided all of England into small sections surrounding a village church, quickly became inadequate. In 1857, Sheffield, with a population of 55,000, had just over 6,000 seats available in churches. In response, a wide variety of people, including Samuel Wilberforce, worked hard to build churches where they were needed, which helps to explain why England has so many Victorian churches. Meanwhile, this physical movement joined with social mobility to upset traditional social structures and long-established class assumptions. For example, Charles Darwin's grandfather, Josiah Wedgwood, started his career as a thrower in his brother's small pottery and ended a millionaire, running a factory which supplied china to the royal family, richer than many of the gentry whose ownership of land gave them social status, but not necessarily wealth. This social upheaval, coupled with the ideas of liberty and equality promulgated by the American and French revolutions, often felt profoundly threatening to those who had benefited from the comparatively stable class system of earlier centuries. The French Revolution, with its atheist and anti-clerical beliefs and rhetoric, was particularly alarming to the church hierarchy. But it was not the only challenge to the church's position. The end of the 18th century saw the rise of Methodism and other dissenting forms of Christianity, that is, Protestant but not Anglican, whose popularity was a huge challenge to the central position of the Church of England. This was made official in the 1820s and 30s, when a series of government initiatives began to undermine the traditional power of the established church, first by giving Protestant dissenters the right to hold public office, and then by the removal of most of the legal restrictions on Catholics in the Catholic Emancipation Act. Shortly after this, the Oxford movement was yet another challenge to traditional Anglicanism. Like Methodism, it originally arose from within the Church of England. Led by a number of Oxford dons, including the brilliant and charismatic John Henry Newman, the movement aimed to revive some of the Roman Catholic beliefs and practices which the Church of England had turned its back on after the Reformation. For many Anglicans, popish practices, like clergy wearing colourful vestments and encouraging frequent celebrations of Holy Communion, were extremely suspect, and these suspicions were confirmed when in 1845 Newman became a Roman Catholic. As the Anglican Bishop of Oxford, Samuel Wilberforce was right in the centre of these controversies. He was sympathetic to some of the ideas of the Oxford movement, but never joined it, uneasily holding the balance between opposing forces in his Oxford diocese. He was also a highly respected amateur scientist who had reviewed The Origin of Species, unfavourably, when it first came out. But although he claimed that his objections to the theory of evolution were purely scientific, it's perhaps not surprising that he should be wary of natural selection, threatening as it was to the idea of a God-given hierarchy in nature, which put humans clearly above animals, and bishops perhaps a little higher than the rest of humanity. Instead, Darwin's theory described the natural world in terms of a disordered struggle between competing life forms, all fighting for their own survival. This was uncomfortably close to the kind of egalitarian ideas that had caused such trouble in France. Although we are now much more convinced by the ideals of liberty and equality that seemed to some so threatening 160 years ago, it's worth considering how bleak the idea of natural selection must have seemed, and perhaps can still seem, So many failed life forms, so much death. The bleakness of this world of few forms the counterpart to the excitement about the natural world that inspired so much poetry and so much science in the 19th century. And it is clear that the cruelty that he saw in nature was an important factor in Darwin's gradual drift away from Christianity. What a book a devil's chaplain might write on the clumsy, wasteful, blundering, and horridly cruel works of nature, he once wrote to his friend Joseph Hooker. The religious and social turmoil of the 19th century plays out very differently in the work of Edward Elgar, the composer of the next two songs. His father was organist at St George's Roman Catholic Church in Worcester, and Elgar's mother became a Catholic before he was born. Elgar was baptised and brought up a Catholic, and in 1900 he expressed his faith in the great oratorio, The Dream of Jarontius. This is a setting of a poem by John Henry Newman, written after his conversion to Catholicism, which describes the journey of a man's soul after death. By the end of his life, Elgar had abandoned his Catholic faith, overcome by a conviction that God hates artists. But in Sabbath Morning at Sea, the first of the two songs we're about to hear, Elgar is clearly attempting to express the importance of his faith to him. The song comes from Elgar's orchestral song cycle, Sea Pictures, written just before The Dream of Jarontius and premiered by Clara Butt in 1899, with Elgar himself conducting. In choosing which verses to set from the original poem, Elgar focused not on Barrett Browning's quite detailed description of the ocean dawn, but rather on the poem's more consciously religious ending. He shall assist me to rise higher, where keep the saints with harp and song, an endless Sabbath morning. The rising chords in the opening encourage us to hear the poem as grand and elevating, and the Wagnerian solemnity of tone has clear echoes of Parsifal. Elgar emphasises the phrase, he shall assist me to rise higher, by repeating it, duly a third higher, before setting the final words to the opening aspiring chords. In Where Corals Lie, a lighter, gentler song, we find another evocation of the tropics, but this time we are clearly back in Europe, imagining rather than experiencing the warm winds and waves. Elgar provides a touch of exoticism with the staccato chords and open fifths, creating a static B minor harmony with echoes of non-Western music.
When Ackland enlisted the help of Ruskin and the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, and they'd made the decision to have a Gothic architecture, the first time that Gothic had been built in Oxford for many years, they set about decorating their new edifice. The aim was to celebrate God's creation, an expression of natural theology, and to illustrate the diversity of life on the planet. And to do that, they enlisted decorative artists, they enlisted sculptors to lavishly decorate the inside of the museum. The original plan was to have murals above the first row of arches, and that was never executed. But in its current form, it's still a very richly decorated building by any modern standards. The architect, Benjamin Woodward, brought across some Irish sculptors who he'd worked with on buildings in Dublin. And they were responsible for the capitals of the columns behind me, which were carved from life from bunches of plants that were brought from the Botanic Gardens each day. And the designs for those capitals were produced not just by the artists, but also by the scientists who were involved in the project. And Phillips, the first keeper, director of the museum, maintained a very close control over which plants and which stone columns he wanted to be represented. The whole building is a very close expression of the interface between art and science in the 19th century. That expression of natural theology was going to be undone when Darwin published his book on the origin of species by natural selection in 1859, just 6 months before the museum opened. And that shifted the scientific debate from one of natural theology to a new mode of science. And really that was what the great debate that was staged as part of the opening ceremony was all about. But that art-science interface is one that is very powerful through to the modern day, and it's one that the museum has been moving back towards. Art has the capability of communicating and engaging with people with science in a way that simply presenting scientific data can't. It doesn't appeal to the emotions in the way that many forms of art can. And so we're very actively experimenting with how we can explore contemporary science with contemporary art in the museum at the moment. But equally, scientific investigation and scientific discovery has the power to inspire artists. And so it's a very fertile two-way communication. And that's very much what we plan in the museum for the next 5 years or so. One of the ways that the museum is exploring the art-science interface is through a programme that we call Visions of Nature, in itself a Ruskin quote. And as part of that programme, we've looked at a variety of visual art through textile art. We've also looked at contemporary dance. And in 2016, we had 3 poets in residence working alongside each other, an unusual experience for the poets. But in turn, those poems became part of a song cycle composed by Cheryl Francis Hode that was premiered in the museum with Carola Darwin as the soprano last year.
The battle between faith and doubt is the subject of the last song, which takes us both back and forward in time. The text is a sonnet by John Milton, written in the 17th century, and the music was written this year, commissioned by Helen Charlston as part of the Isolation Songbook, a collection of 15 songs by 15 different composers written in response to the coronavirus lockdown. Milton's sonnet is a meditation on his blindness, which struck him in middle age and which he feared would prevent him from continuing to work as a poet, translator, and scholar. How could he do the work that he believed God had given him to do if he couldn't see? In the poem, the answer is offered to him by the figure of Patience, who says, "Sometimes all you can do is wait." And Milton did wait, and he found that he could still compose poetry, although no longer able to write. He dictated his great work, Paradise Lost, to his daughters, and in 1831, Darwin chose to take Paradise Lost with him on the voyage of the Beagle, among the few possessions that he could fit into his cabin. The composer Stephen Bick explains his choice of the text like this: "I've always liked this poem. Milton's anguish about wanting to accomplish great things but being unable to because of various constraints is perennially relevant, but felt all the more so during lockdown. This timelessness is audible in the music too. In a moment, you'll hear how the composer has taken us even further back in time, using one of the 16th century English composer Thomas Tallis's modes, which gives the song a flavour of the Renaissance, though in a style which is nonetheless clearly modern. The Great Debate has often been caricatured as a struggle between the enlightened modern forces of science and the reactionary prejudiced upholders of religious orthodoxy. But as you understand more of the world in which the debate took place, I believe it becomes clear that this is indeed a caricature. Certainly, Darwin's ideas were new and challenging, but those opposing them included a number of highly respected scientists, as well as churchmen. Conversely, Darwin was delighted to find that Charles Kingsley, a well-known cleric and author of several books, was enthusiastic about evolution and saw no conflict with his own religious beliefs. In some ways, the Great Debate can be seen as a struggle over intellectual territory. Were scientific questions to be determined only by scientists? Was there space for non-scientists to engage with or challenge scientific ideas on social, emotional, philosophical or theological grounds? And although most people now agree that the theory of evolution is a hugely important and valuable part of our understanding of the world, there is still plenty to discuss about its implications, whether it is in attempts to prevent a major environmental crisis or in the battle against coronavirus. To some of the later editions of The Origin of Species, Darwin added a quotation from Francis Bacon, which considered the claims of divinity, what we would call theology, and philosophy, which we would now call science. To conclude, therefore, let no man out of a weak conceit of sobriety or an ill-applied moderation think or maintain that a man can search too far or be too well studied in the book of God's word or in the book of God's works, divinity or philosophy, but rather let me endeavour an endless proficiency in both. Ultimately, Darwin is saying, what matters is that we go on thinking and investigating and talking about these things because they matter. The best way to resolve our differences is to know more. To this I would add, yes, to know more, but also to talk more. The best thing about the Great Debate was that it was a debate, a discussion between knowledgeable people about things that were important to them, things which seemed strange and fearful, as well as exciting and new, and where a variety of contradictory opinions were listened to and considered. As Rabbi Jonathan Sacks says, the greatest single antidote to violence is conversation, speaking our fears, listening to the fears of others, and in that sharing of vulnerabilities, discovering a genesis of hope. Let the conversation continue.
Half my days in this dark world.